Question number 2, David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, does he stand by his statement that he is, quote, deeply concerned about the Fonterra whey protein scare? And if so, is he satisfied that parents in New Zealand and overseas now have accurate information on this issue?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I'm satisfied that government agencies are working hard to provide New Zealand parents and caregivers with the utmost up-to-date information that they have. Parents should continue to monitor the MPI website, call Healthline and Plunket Line for further advice. In respect of overseas customers, their respective regulatory agencies are responsible for providing information to their consumers. MPI and MFAT are giving those regulators the latest information as they have it.
Supplementary question, David Shearer.
What role is the Ministry of Health taking to reassure parents that the baby formula they are feeding to their child is safe?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my understanding is that the Ministry of Health have been involved with the response group that was established by the government. The Minister of Health has been involved in every teleconference I was involved in over the weekend. I stand corrected, but as Director General was involved right through the weekend in terms of all of the information, and the Ministry of Health website has been updated, and we've been monitoring any admissions to hospitals around the country for any signs that might indicate that a baby has consumed infant formula that is tainted.
Supplementary question, David Shearer.
Were ministers told of the issue before the Ministry of Primary Industries, and if so, what actions did those ministers take?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, my understanding is that 12:35 on Friday, Fonterra advised the Ministry for Primary Industries, and then from there the other contact flowed with ministers.
Supplementary question, David Shearer.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Is he satisfied that the protocols, if those protocols exist between MPI and Fonterra, resulted in timely disclosure?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think it would be very difficult for me to give an answer to that actually today. I think we do need to go and have a full inquiry. I mean, we have made it quite clear, or I think the companies made it quite clear that they were aware on the Wednesday, and yet MPI wasn't aware until Friday lunchtime. Now, I can't explain that gap in time. I think that's one of the very real issues that needs to be looked at.
Supplementary question, David Shearer.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Given the Chinese media is calling 100% pure brand a festering sore, what urgent action is he taking today to limit the fallout to New Zealand?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, I think in reality the first issue we need to do is actually identify all of the potentially contaminated product and make sure it's off the shelves and not accessible by consumers. I think secondly from there we need to be transparent actually with all international countries that trade with us, or in countries that trade with us, that we actually have gone and looked at what went wrong and ensured that it won't happen again, and then ultimately we need to continue to communicate with our customer markets. But I do think a bit of perspective needs to be put on this. I'm not in any way downplaying the very seriousness of what's taken place, but I think we can also look back on 100 years of trading food internationally and of, generally speaking, very, very safe and high quality standards.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister in a position to tell us whether the tests in March 2013 that found Clostridium in those ingredients, whether that test, and at that point we didn't know whether it was a toxic form of Clostridium, whether the finding of Clostridium in March 2013 triggered some kind of notification to the Ministry of and the Minister of Primary Industries?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, authoritatively I can't be sure, but I think it's fairly unlikely that it did trigger a response to MPI. My understanding of the way things went, I think, is that when they did the test in March, I think that was partly done in Australia, you should see that showed up. They spoke to the company, and the company did a series of other tests, but it was only really of Wednesday of last week when the company was sure, as a result of all of its testing, that it had a potentially very serious problem.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russel Norman.
Is the Minister in a position to tell us why there was a 5-month delay between the identification of some kind of Clostridium and the final identification that it was actually Clostridium botulinum?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No, but I think the member asks a very good question and will be part of the review that will be undertaken.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Does the Minister believe that there should be some kind of automatic process whereby when a food manufacturer, like Fonterra, but any other as well, finds Clostridium in their product, particularly a product that's destined for infant formula, that MPI should immediately be told that there is a potential problem?
Right Honourable Prime
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, that might be something that can form part of the review. I suspect that Fonterra may argue, and other manufacturers may argue, that that actually shows up more regularly than we think. But in fact, it depends on the circumstances, because one can only assume that Fonterra themselves certainly don't want to do damage to its markets and its customers, and therefore, if that really had sent the alarm bells ringing back in March of 2013, one assumed they would have acted much faster than they did. So they obviously believed it wasn't a serious enough threat to stop the production of that infant baby formula.
Quick. Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Accepting that answer, does the Minister agree that having found Clostridium, it should have been an urgent question that needed answering very quickly as to whether that was Clostridium botulinum rather than just a harmless kind of Clostridium, because the answer to that question was critical to whether they should have allowed more of the product to go forward into the food chain?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, well, again, I think the member makes exactly the right point, and we just simply can't answer that question today. But it does seem very, very odd that they allowed their production to carry on and for that infant baby formula to go into the supply chain or into the distribution chain. So one can only assume that they believed, right up until Wednesday of last week, that that was not an issue. But I can't explain why they don't think that was an issue, but their scientists in fullness of time may be able to.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Has the Minister put this question to MPI, rather than just Fonterra, as to whether MPI believes that there should have been much quicker action on having found the generic kind of Clostridium?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I personally haven't, although there was a sort of roundtable discussion yesterday with the Acting Director General, which sort of broadly traversed these kinds of topics. I suspect those sort of questions have been asked, but the Acting Director General has been extremely focused on trying to understand and quantify exactly the issue and where the product actually is. And so, as I've sort of said on numerous occasions, there'll be plenty of time to look at these questions, but it really probably hasn't been the top priority in the last 48 hours.
Question number 3, Paul Goldsmith.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Finance.